So in this video, we're going to take a look at the event bus, a universal event bus in Vue. This is a style of application data management that takes into account sort of a publish and subscribe type of model. If you ever played Animal Crossing, you know there's a billboard in the middle of town. Anybody can post something up there and anybody can go and read something from it. That's sort of what the event bus is. So with a publish subscribe model, generally what you're doing is you are defining certain events that happen when certain things are happening within the application. And you have components that are emitting those events. And then you can have other components that are listening for that specific type of event. And when they get it, then they can do something with it. They can perform some sort of action, run some block of code. The nice thing is that these components don't have to know about each other at all. All they have to do is be able to connect to the same event bus in order to listen to and publish events onto. So this actually makes for a very decoupled application. In certain instances, that can be extremely useful. We'll look at some of the pluses and the pitfalls here as we get into this more. And so let's take a look at the Vue book search using a event bus. So again, we'll start off where we always start off at main.js. You can see here that I have this layout component. This sort of acts, before we saw a parent component that was sort of managing everything. This layout component is more of like a component that displays child components, but it doesn't really do anything with them. We'll take a look at that in a minute. You can also see that I'm loading up the API service here right from the get-go before we even have Vue really running. Why is that? Well, that's because in using an event bus, the API is no longer necessarily used by a component. It's not being called by a component. It is being triggered based on events that happen within the application. So if we open up the API service, we're going to find that it actually is a little bit different than it was before. So here, we load in Axios like we did before, but now we have an event bus that we're loading in. And we have a method that is search for title. And when it finds information, it is going to use that event bus to emit an event, a books.update event. And the data for that event is the data that comes back from the API. So it's that list of books. The API is now sort of handling itself within this application. You'll also find out right here, down here on line 17, we have an event bus and it's now listening. So the on is that it is listening for something. When the query string is updated, it's going to run the search for title, which will then emit a book called, or an event called books.update, right? So the API is actually handling itself within the event bus. This is why we have to load it in main.js, so it can register these events and these event listeners, and then it handles itself essentially. So if we ever have any component anywhere trigger a query.update event on the event bus, the API will automatically kick in, run its code, and then emit its own event for other components to pick up on that there's a new list of books. You can think of each piece within the application now is managing itself. It is managing itself based on an event-driven model where they are listening and publishing on this event bus in order to get their jobs done, irrespective of what everybody else is doing. Like, I really don't care what the component next door is doing. All I care about is that this event triggered, and that means I need to run this code and throw this event. And so the API service is now sort of doing that on its own. So what is this event bus? Well, this event bus is actually a library I'm loading in called MIT. MIT is an event bus that, as you saw, it lets you listen for certain events. You can also turn off listening for certain events. So because we're sort of doing event management now, we have to manage our own, each component has to manage its own listening, and I'm no longer listening for events. And it also lets you emit events on this event bus. So this is something that is now universally used across everything. And because it's a const and we're exporting it here, this will create one event bus, and then every time we import it into another component, they're all going to get the same object in memory. So they're all on the same universal event bus. So the layout component now really just loads in some components and puts them on the screen. And to a great extent, that's all it's doing. I realized, you know what? I didn't actually clean this stuff up. I will clean this up when I actually put this out, but none of this stuff is needed anymore. None of that's needed at all. All we don't even need this. We're not loading this in anymore. It really is just loading in components and then showing them on the page. And that's all it's doing now at this point. It is no longer a switchboard. It is basically like a blank piece of paper that we're pasting things onto, right? Our components. So that's a very different way of managing this stuff than we had in the parent-child. And so really all of the real stuff that's happening is happening in the child components. So if we look at, if we look at the book search, so book search now has, this same form. It's still, when the form gets submitted, call perform search. The big difference is we're importing our event bus. That gives us the event bus that everybody is listening to and listening on. And whenever the perform search is done, we emit a query.update and we tell everybody, hey, there's a new query. And we put the data out there. And we don't care what anybody does with it. There's no logic in here that tells you what happens when that event kicks off. We just know that this component sends that event off, and that's it. So you could have something that is calling the API. You could have something that, maybe this is a search for something completely different. And whatever is listening on that event bus is going to pick that up, that the query was updated, and then do something with it. So who is actually doing something with it at this point? Well, this query.update, if we remember, that's the event that the API service was listening for. And when that comes in, it calls this search for title, and it does the title search on the API. And then it emits its own event, books.update. Well, who's listening to that? Actually, an easy way to figure that out is to do a file search. So you could search within your files for that event name, and then you will see who is listening for it and who's finding it. A better way, honestly, is to document this stuff. One of the things, you can see these things are so completely decoupled. If you're trying to troubleshoot, hey, I'm typing this in and I hit search and nothing's happening, it becomes harder to troubleshoot what is going wrong in that scenario, because it's hard to know who is listening for that event. The actual links between components are kind of separated now. They're very decoupled. And so documentation becomes a huge issue when you're talking about building an application using an event bus. You really have to document your events. Is really important. It's good to document which events components are sending and which events components are listening to. This becomes a documentation problem if you don't watch out for it. When this gets big enough, there are so many events. You need to make sure that events are in some way namespaced. You can see I rewrote my event names here, so it's like books.update. You need to be able to read the code and know what is happening when those events are happening. So book tiles, again, we pull in our event bus and we on mounted. So when this component is mounted on the page, we register a listener for the event. And the event we're listening for is books.update. When a new books.update event fires, we get our books and we set it to our data. So we are actually duplicating the data now at this point too. So each component will have its own copy of books if it's listening for this event. So we're registering this on mounted. It doesn't mean that we're getting books on mounted, right? We're only saying, hey, if you get this event, I want you to run this block of code at that point. And then once that mounted is done, now we're just sitting here and we're waiting, right? And at some point in the future, someone types something into the query box, hits enter, that kicks off the search for the API. The API then triggers the event books.update, sends that list of books out, and then we get it. And we put it into our data. The minute it's put into our data, it's reactive. And so that will then kick this off, which will, for every book, it will create a book tile passing in the book from that array. So this is now handling the logic of sort of managing that data. It's still not calling the API. It doesn't know where these books are coming from. This makes it extremely easy to unit test these components because they're decoupled from any other logic other than their own logic. They are self-contained within here, and that's a big benefit for something like an event bus and event-driven components. So all you would have to do in a unit test is create an array of books, trigger that event on the event bus, and then you can see if it, if the component does the right thing. So then on book tile, we pull in the API service, but that's just to call this method again. So we're just sort of pulling in this method from here. We get our event bus. We still get props. So props are still useful within this, right? So we have the book tiles that's going through an array, and then it sets a book as a prop on the book tile. But if someone clicks on the book, so we have our click handler up here for select book. If someone clicks on the book, we're going to emit a book select event. We're just saying like, hey, a book was clicked. Now what happens when a book is clicked? Well, in this application, we're going to open a details page, but we could have just as easily listened for that event in a shopping cart and put the book in the shopping cart. We could have listened to that event for a favorites list, right? And added it to the favorites. There's this component, this book tile, does not care what happens. It only cares that it got clicked. These are very selfish components now at this point. So book.select, and then it passes in the book. This is the book that got clicked. What do we want to do? Well, this is where we decide what we want to do with this. And so we will do the book detail. So on book detail, again, in mounted, we say, hey, you're going to be put on the page, and then it tells the event bus, hey, if you ever get a book.select, I want you to run this chunk of code, right? And that chunk of code is going to get the book and set it to its data. Again, we're duplicating that data within our application by putting it into another component. So it will put that into the book data element. So these are data elements now, right? Not props. These are actual data pieces that this component controls. When the book.select event happens, there's a book that's passed along with that. It'll take that book data and it'll set it into itself, which will then show the modal. So here I put the VIF on the book detail. And this is an interesting contrast between the parent-child. The book detail is actually handling whether it shows or not. And so if a book is set, then it will show all of that information. When close detail is clicked, it will set the book back to undefined, which will then get rid of that and make it disappear. So you can see the components are now really managing themselves. They are much more insular than they were when you had parent-child. Parent-child, this parent has to understand how everything is working. It has to understand all of the children underneath it. And to a certain degree, that kind of breaks encapsulation. That's kind of a bad design to a certain degree. But within the event bus, we now have these things are so decoupled that they manage themselves. They know what they're doing. The problem is it's hard to look at this as a whole and understand what everything is doing because they are so insular. And they each kind of they have their own copies of this data. Now, if someone did like edit a book and we wanted to save that, the best way to do that would be to emit an event that was like book.update and have the API service listen for that event. And if it found it, it would grab it, get all the data for that updated book, send it back to the API, and then throw an event saying, hey, this book is updated for the application. And then every component would have to listen for that event, get that data, put it within its data. So you can see if you have a lot of data processes going on, the event bus ends up being very complicated. Everybody is fending for themselves. There is no one central place where this data is living, and everybody has to know how to manage themselves and the data. And the more data you have, the more that could be an issue if every component is touching everything. If you're able to keep your components extremely focused, very narrowly focused on certain things like a book update form or a book detail, right? I am here to show you a book. And the minute you don't want to see that book anymore, I'm going away. right? Really need to hone in on what these components are doing and really make it fine-grained in order to do that. Otherwise, though, the event bus is something that I have used, especially event bus is extremely useful if you're not doing a full view application. An example of this would be that you have a normal sort of like Laravel application and you're building all of your JavaScript as sort of view components, but it's not a single page app, right? You're generating HTML and you're putting view components in at different places, but you still want them to sort of talk to each other. The universal event bus is great for that sort of a model because they each get sort of a handle on that one event bus, but they're not part of the same application, which means you can't do the parent-child, right? You don't have a parent, you don't have children. They're sort of isolated and on their own. You could have them all share the same event bus, and then they can actually communicate to each other and send events and, be able to listen for that sort of a thing. The nice thing about the way this event bus is set up, this is just JavaScript. Like this API service is not a view component. You could actually have view components talking to jQuery components as long as they're all connecting via the same event bus. This is just a JavaScript object, but it's using the same event bus that everybody else is, and so it can listen to and emit events on that event bus, and then the view components can pick that up and do something with it. So here you have a plain old JavaScript file that is able to talk to view components, and the view components can talk to your plain old JavaScript file. So this is a really interesting way of setting this up and could be useful for something you're looking at in the future. So last but not least, we're going to look at this same application, but using Vuex. What's the difference? How are these things set up differently? We're going to take a look at that.